My name's Dean Croke, Chief Insight Officer here at FreightWaves. What I'd like to share with you today is some new data that we've got on the intermodal side. It's a really exciting data set. It's important for shippers, carriers, and brokers to look at the rail industry because it's a viable alternative for truckload carriers to both use as a source of capacity. Last year, when capacity was tight, we had a lot of asset-based carriers moving freight on trailers on flat cars, so they would literally put their 53-foot trailer on a flat car and the railroads would haul it. And then a lot of shippers in the industry also use intermodal as a viable alternative on the long haul space, in particular with commodities that can sit in the supply chain for longer periods of time. So intermodal is a viable transportation mode in this country. There are two components to it that we've had in SONAR for quite a while, and I'll take you into the SONAR dashboard and show you what they look like. So if we start with a sandbox here, which is kind of where I do a lot of my working, I'll go in here and type in RTOTC, which is total carloads here in the United States. I could break it out by class 1, class 2, or in Canada or Mexico. And I'm just going to look here and show you that year to date, you can see that volumes have been trending down. Generally, carloads are down about 5% year over year in the class 1 railroads, where there's 7 railroads hauling most of the carloads. Now, in SONAR, carloads mean things like tank cars of crude oil, open hoppers of grain, barley, things like chemicals, pressurized tanks. You'll see a lot of specialized flat cars hauling lumber out of Canada. So carloads in the rail industry refer to something that's not intermodal. It's not 53-foot containers or trailers. It's carloads where you've got grain and things like that. So if I went in here and typed, if I wanted to compare and say, of the 238,000 carloads, how many of those were crude oil? And I type in rtopp.usa, and I could see here that 116,000 of those were, in fact, crude oil, which is under the petroleum product. If I said, how many of those were grain? I could type in RTOG, and you'd see grain mill products pop up there. So of that, 8,540 were what we would call grain, and grain could be wheat, barley, mostly soybeans. So we can break out the carload data by multiple different commodities. There's about 10 commodities. You can break it out by scrap metal. You can look at sand, oil, coal, etc. So that's on the carload side. So if we thought, okay, how much of the rail business that we see each week, how much of that is actually intermodal? So I could type in RTO, and I want to do intermodal containers, type in RIC. And what I see here is that it's about the same, give or take. We move 238,000 carloads of things like crude oil, lumber, soybeans, and we move 212,000 or 211,836 intermodal containers in the 7 days up until last Sunday. So this data comes out every Wednesday on the carload side, and we populate it into SONAR on a Thursday morning, but it's for the Sunday ending the prior week. So this was data up until last Sunday. So it gives us a sense that about half, in fact, it's about 46% of all railroad volume is in fact intermodal. And it's a significant part of what railroads do. If I said, now let me make that the main symbol. Let me flip intermodal containers to the top, and I'll take out carloads because now I just want to look at intermodal. And of the intermodal, I would like to look at how much of that is on trailers. So I could type in rtoit.usa, and I could see that about 18,500 trailers were moved last week, which are 53-foot trailers, 20-foot trailers, well, maybe not 20-foot, maybe 28-foot LTL trailers mostly. So most of the trailers you see being lifted onto trains are typically 28-foot and 40-foot. They're the most common combination I see at the moment. But I'll blow this out to a 1-year view, and you see something really interesting happening. Intermodal volumes, and if I go to do a trend line change here, what I'll see is that intermodal volumes from this point to this point, just before Labor Day, they're down about 4.4%. So the railroads are somewhat concerned about their declining intermodal volumes. And of course, intermodal volumes have declined because truckload capacity has been very loose. Spot rates and paper rates have been dropping also in the last 12 months. So truckload has actually taken back some of the capacity that moved to the railroad market last year. If I look at trailers, what I see is something very different. Trailers are down about 10.41%. Their volumes are decreasing at a higher rate. So remember, trailer on flat car was a source of extra capacity for trucking asset-based carriers last year when they couldn't find drivers to move freight or find trucks to move freight. They put a lot of that freight that could sit in a supply chain longer, they put that on trains. Now, there's a couple of things have happened. That volume has started to shift back towards the roadside for a couple of reasons. One is some of the railroads have actually terminated their trailer on flat car business because they deemed it to be not profitable. If you think about the space of an 85-foot rail car, what would you rather put on it? A 53-foot trailer and a 28-foot pup? Or would you rather put two 53-foot containers on a well car that only takes up about 65 feet? So what you see happening is the railroads are actually looking to move away from trailer on flat car because you can fit more volume on a train by double stacking 53-foot containers on what's called a well car. So part of the precision scheduled railroading practice that the railroads are bringing in is identifying practices, services that they offer that are unprofitable, that take up more space for less revenue per mile. Trailers fit into that category, so some of them have been cancelled. Market forces have also converted some of that freight back to road. And if you look at some of the rates out of Los Angeles to Dallas, for example, you'll find road and rail are about the same. So given that trucks can get to the endpoint much quicker than trains can, we've found that a lot of freight on the trailer side has moved back to road as opposed to being on flat cars. So that's kind of an overview of what we've got in SONAR. I'll just undo both of those now. So this is what we've had up until this point, which is a weekly number. We've only been able to show you a weekly number. Now what I'd like to do is show you our new intermodal data, which is a breakdown of that total of 238,000, and it breaks it down by market, by length of container, and by direction of travel. I'll start here. This is down the bottom here. If you go to this little icon there's a train icon when you go into the heat maps, and it'll show you all the different railroads here. So you can click on all the railroads. Railroads are pretty much have a geographic area they run, like the BNS and UP run pretty much out of Chicago all the way to the West Coast. CN, Canadian National, runs all the way down here to New Orleans and ports like that. You see a big hub here in the center. Chicago is a massive market. Memphis is also a really big market. But you can see over here that Norfolk Southern and CSX dominate the East Coast also. Now, our data doesn't break it out by railroads, but I wanted to show you the railroad network and how it's mapped together. We've got some other data points here, and I'll show you this one down the bottom. I'll actually show you here. I'll go into my sandbox and show you how this looks. I'll go in and I'm going to add a map, and the map's going to be, I'm going to add a heat map. I'm going to click on the train icon here, and this is where you can select different railroads. That's how you do that in SONAR. If I wanted to look at just Norfolk Southern, for example, I could uncheck all of those, and I could see where Norfolk Southern run. So that's what we've got on the railroad side. If I go up here and I go to US markets, I'll turn on the chloropleth. And what I want to do down here is I want to go in and I'm going to type in rail to see. So I've got inbound rail volume, outbound rail volume. Let me look at outbound monthly total inbound. I want to look at weekly bound rail. I want to look at, I'll just go back and type in rail, and we'll just show you how some of those heat maps pan out. So you can look at, we've got 20 foot, 40 foot. If I said, let's look at the monthly total outbound volume loaded out of different markets. I've got to go back in and turn off my train here, turn that off, minimize that. So what I can see here is that there's only a few markets that pop up. This is the monthly total 20-foot containers. And I'm going to take off the hover function, and I'll move that back, make that a little bit bigger, click out of that. What you see here is that there's very few markets where 20-foot containers move. But if I want to take it to monthly inbound 53-foot containers, I would see something very different. I would see markets like Los Angeles. There's a lot of 53-foot containers moved to Los Angeles. I would see Chicago. I would see the Harrisburg markets. I would see Atlanta, and I see Dallas. So rail generally moves within 4 or 5 markets. The top 10 markets in this country account for about 34% of all intermodal volumes, and you're looking at them on a map right now. If I said, okay, let's look at monthly or weekly total outbound volume, let me look at 53s, which are the primary intermodal volume. What you see here is that the intermodal volumes on the outbound side are pretty much the same as the 20-foot side. I'll go and look at the inbound side here and show you that monthly inbound 53s. And again, you see a similar pattern. So when we break up, like we do with truckload volume, when we break out the the 48 states into 135 freight markets, what we've done is we've mapped the intermodal volume to the same freight market, so you can be able to compare the volumes of the two. So that's how you can look at it on a heat map. Unfortunately, there's not much to look at because most of the rail activity is dominated by a few markets. You don't have railroad markets out in the Midwest, for example. Most of it is Los Angeles, Seattle, Dallas, Memphis to a degree, Atlanta, a little bit up here around New Jersey, Allentown, and of course Chicago. So there's only about 10 markets that you need to watch on a regular basis in terms of the volumes. Now, what I'll do here is I'll show you this dashboard that I've built here, which is my lane analysis. And this is the weekly intermodal volumes for all container sizes. And then I've got it here at the KMA market level. So if you wanted to look at, for example, which is the biggest traffic lane here, I could connect on this particular up arrow here, and I could see that the highest volume of containers up until last Sunday were on the Los Angeles to Chicago lane. The second highest was Chicago, Los Angeles. And that's important because these, about 30% of all intermodal volume is going to move between Chicago and Los Angeles. And Chicago is a big rail hub. It's a big intermodal hub where some trains, some dray operators move containers across town, what we call a rubber tire or a dray move, and then it goes on another Class 1 railroad further east to maybe Worcester, Mass, or Elizabeth, New Jersey. So some of the volume goes into Chicago. It's a bit of a intersection hub. It's also a massive freight market for all kinds of activity. So we always look at Los Angeles to Chicago as a really good indicator of freight volumes. It reflects a lot of the freight volumes that are coming out of Asia. A lot of that imports that we saw last year and this year land in ports like Los Angeles, Long Beach, on Oakland in San Francisco, even as far north as Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and up into Prince Rupert, up in British Columbia. All of those ports are all good intermodal ports to look at because when you look at the volumes of those ports, you get a sense of what freight flows are going to be looking like as the freight moves east across the country. The third highest was Los Angeles to Dallas. It moved 9,278 containers of all sizes last week. It was up 10.8%. But you'll notice on the big volume here, Los Angeles, Chicago, and return, both those volumes are down. That's something that's really important to watch. Volumes were down on the Chicago to New York lane. New York to Chicago was also down. Dallas to Los Angeles was down, et cetera, et cetera. So you could go down through here and have a look at all of the different lanes, but I've stack ranked this so you can see what intermodal volume is the biggest on each lane. Now, I could go in and change this to a 53-foot container. I could look at all sorts of different permutations of this. I could make this a little bit smaller and add another chart in here if I wanted to. On this side here, I've built a watch list, and if I sort this, what this will tell me is just the biggest freight market. So the Los Angeles freight market here, which will include the Ontario truck market, or ONT, as you will be familiar with. It's the biggest market by far. The second biggest market for outbound rail volume for 20-foot, 40-foot, 45-foot, 48-foot, and 53-foot containers, empty or loaded, is Chicago. And then it's Dallas, then it's Elizabeth, New Jersey, then it's Seattle and Atlanta. So if you think back to that heat map that I showed you a minute ago, these are all the markets that pop up on the heat map: Harrisburg, Memphis, Atlanta, Seattle, Elizabeth. So in terms of volume, there's about 10 major markets that you need to watch. That's about 34% of the weekly volume. You can break down the data sets into loaded and empty. So this is important because on this weekly outbound rail volume here, if I click on Chicago, you'll see that this is the weekly outbound volume here. And if I blow this out to a 1-year view, and if I could compare loaded versus empty on this one, this tells you how volumes are moving out of Chicago. And there was a period earlier this year where there was a big increase in volume of freight moving to Chicago. That was as a result of the big pull forward of freight from Asia to Los Angeles. And then a lot of those containers have had to move back to the West Coast so that those containers could move back to Asia before the busy period starts that we're starting to see right now on the ocean side. So lots of really good data points in here. Again, in terms of functionality, you know how to click on the chart there. If I wanted to look at the trend line around Los Angeles to Chicago, for example, I could click on that arrow. And if I take this out to a 1-year view, what you see here is, I think, absolutely fascinating that year-to-date volumes, and remember the March period, this drop down here, this is typically the quiet period in ocean shipping. This is a quiet period. Generally, it's after Chinese New Year. You can see the big pull forward of pre-tariff freight here. We have the Chinese New Year period, then volumes die off. And then as volumes start to increase, you can see that the intermodal volumes have increased out of Los Angeles. And a lot of this increase here is as a result of this volume of freight coming in on the import side, going into warehouses and gradually moving out across the country as consumer demand has created a need for those products that were originally just brought into the country before January 1 and put into storage. So a lot of this volume you're seeing on Los Angeles, Chicago, is a lot of the pre-tariff volume you're seeing now moving out across the country. If I want to do a quick compare and just test that theory, if I go in and do IMP TEU and then type in Los Angeles, and then I do a dual axis, what I should be able to see is a relationship between the two. And I'll make this a little bit smaller here so you can see the chart that's a bit bigger. But you can see here that this is the import containers. So this is the number of TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units, into Los Angeles. You can see how it correlates really tightly. If I make this a little bit bigger, you can see the pull forward of pre-tariff freight here in the last quarter of last year, and then it dropped right off. And then you can see that as import containers have increased, so have the outbound rail volumes. So there's lots of good data here. I could also map that to, for example, our weekly custom data, and I could type in LAX. So this is the weekly WCSTM, which is weekly customs, LAX. And I could look at the number of shipments coming in. And again, I see a very tight correlation between the number of outbound rail containers and the volume of shipments on the import side. So this is data that is as a result of the bills of lading that get lodged as a container arrives at a port and clears customs. And it's the number of shipments. And the shipments could be, you could have multiple shipments per container, but as you just saw prior slide, chart, sorry, the actual correlation between containers and shipments are very high. So this is a really good data set to see what volumes are going to be looking like on the rail side. This also maps to OTVI. If you looked at OTVI in Ontario, and I'll do that right now, I'll take off customs imports and I'll type in OTVI.Ontario, where a lot of the outbound tender volume comes from. And it's you don't quite, I mean, you've got a daily indice here against a weekly one. Let me see if I could do a OTVI monthly. If I look at the Ontario monthly one, and I'll put that on I'll take off OTVI here, and I haven't looked at this before, but I'm just curious to see if there's a relationship between the two, and I'll take that out to year to date to see if there's a relationship. And you can see some spikes on the outbound tender volume side on the truck side that line up with rail volumes. So you can see there's a little bit of volatility in this data. Obviously, the volumes are a lot less on the truckload side than the rail side because it's a major intermodal lane. So again, we can compare rail volumes with truck volumes. This is important to be able to look at the two, because the people that use truckload, as in the shippers that are organising all of the freight for us to haul, also use intermodal. So it's important to look at intermodal volume, particularly those shippers that are on the call, because it gives you a sense of where both markets are going in terms of volume. It tells you about capacity constraints that are most likely to emerge. And of course, if I type in intermodal rates, ITM-RM, and I look at Los Angeles, Chicago, for example, I can see what the spot rates are doing on that particular lane. So we also have intermodal spot rates that you can overlay, and it tells you about how the two compare. You might say, well, why does that make any difference? Well, I could type in datvf.vnu and have a look at our national van rate and get a sense of where van rates are relative to intermodal. And you can see here that truckload rates generally have been much higher than intermodal rates. They're about $1.28 a mile nationally. Truckload rates are at about $1.44 a mile nationally. Typically, intermodal rates have been cheaper than truckload. That's been the major play that intermodal's been able to promote to shippers. Of course, the challenge is the service levels they provide and how long it takes to get the goods moved. And with truckload capacity so loose in the market, teams can run out of Los Angeles to Chicago much quicker than the fastest train can. So that's part of the reason they've been able to pull back some intermodal volume from the railroads and put it back on road. So again, a couple of quick looks at different data sets there, but there's a lot of new data in SONAR that's on the weekly outbound loaded. You could look at weekly inbound loaded volumes. You can look at it by length of container, loaded, empty, as I've said before. Here's another watch list view that I've built. And again, I can send you all of these links. This is pretty easy to do. But essentially what I've done is I've created a watch list that's broken out by length of container and on lane. So I can tell what lanes are moving what volume of containers each week. And I'll just quickly go through and sort these into the highest values. I'll click on the up arrow there and make them all the highest value. So on the biggest lane in terms of 53s is Los Angeles, Chicago. The biggest lane on 40 foots is Los Angeles to Dallas. If I sort here on 20-foot containers, I can see that the biggest lane is going to be, biggest lane here is going to be, I'm doing the wrong one. Click on value. The biggest lane on the 20-foot is Los Angeles, Chicago. So why is this important? Well, the 20-foot and 40-foot containers are essentially your international imports. So freight that comes in a 20 and a 40-foot container that either can't be transloaded into a 53 out in Ontario, or there are certain types of freight that you can't double handle, and some freight literally just moves as it comes off the ship straight onto a train and moves east. And they're the 20s and 40s. Now, a lot of those 20s and 40s, because they're international containers, have to go back to the West Coast or the East Coast and then be sent back to Asia or Europe empty. Most of them go back empty. Some of them get loaded and dehired in their ports, and then exporters load them. But essentially what you see is a massive volume of containers, 20s and 40s, moving to the east, particularly Chicago. Once they're unloaded by the dray trucks, they eventually have to be moved back to the West Coast before they're repositioned for either exports or sent back empty. So watching 20s and 40s gives you a really good sense of how we're doing on the export-import side. And on the 53-foot side, these are mostly going to be out of Los Angeles, either shippers using 53-foot intermodal containers for domestic shipping, or 40-foot or 20-foot containers that have been unloaded and then reloaded into 53s. The general rule of thumb that we hear from intermodal specialists is that you can put roughly 2 40-foot containers, you can put 3 40s into 2 53s, for example. So there's a consolidation reason that you might want to be transloading containers from 40s and 20s into a 53-foot. But essentially the 53s can be double stacked, so can the 40s. And sometimes you'll see a 40 and a 20 in different configurations. So there's lots of different ways that the railroads stack containers. But in SONAR, we've got it broken out for you by the volume and the rate of change. I've also got another watch list built over here, which is essentially the total of all of those three. It's the all side of that. And you could sort by up and down based on volume, rate of change, or however you wanted to sort that. But again, lots of really good data in here. You can build lots of watch lists so you could create the market that you want to watch or the lane that you want to watch the most. What I'll also show you now is some of the other, and I'm just sharing with you some of the home screens that I've built. I'm more than happy to share those with you. But what I look at here are the top 10 markets, and I covered this in the Daily Watch today. If you read the Daily Watch, what you will have seen is that we reported on the top 10 markets. They account for about 34% of all the intermodal volume for the 5 container lengths. So this is weekly outbound rail volume. So this is loaded and empty containers. and it's for 20-foot, 40, 45, 48, and 53s. So this is really interesting because we can see that since, week over week, Los Angeles to Chicago is down 3%. They moved 14,000, 513 containers. You can see there the green. The green are the three markets where volumes increased, which was Los Angeles to Memphis, Los Angeles to Dallas, and Seattle to Chicago. And Seattle to Chicago is really interesting because I showed you that one a little bit earlier, and I'll click on that market there and drill into that a bit more. And again, weekly outbound rail container volumes, Los Angeles to Chicago, took a big increase here. They're up year to date. It's a really interesting phenomenon. We're seeing more and more volume come into Seattle. This might be useless trivia, but Seattle is actually the closest port to Shanghai. A lot of freight used to go into Los Angeles, Long Beach, but because of congestion in that particular port, shippers and rail and ocean carriers have looked for other ports. And if you draw a straight line from Shanghai to Seattle, it's actually about 1,200 kilometers or a day's sailing closer than Los Angeles. So that's why we're seeing more and more freight being shipped to the Pacific Northwest. Why would truckload carriers or brokers or shippers want to know that? Well, Seattle has been a strong backhaul market for truckload carriers for many, many years. And spot rates are really low. There's always downward pressure. There's more freight goes in than comes out. So if you're a truckload carrier, an asset-based carrier, or a broker in that space, it's really important to watch the import volumes coming into Seattle and then looking at the volume of freight that potentially could either go on rail or could go on a 53-foot dry van. So again, we're seeing some volume spike this week. If I go in here and type in a weekly custom cstm.sea, what I should see is a relationship between the two, and I'll put this on a dual axis. So you can see that, and I'll put this a little bit tighter here. Now, what you notice here is that this is the 26% increase in volume up until Sunday. But if you go back and look here, see this where my cursor is. This is the weekly customs import. They spiked in the prior week. So the volume on the train lines follows the prior week when the import customs shipments spiked, because it takes a while for the containers to be unloaded, for the paperwork to be cleared through customs, for the containers to be drayed or shifted to a rail yard, or in the case of some of the Pacific Northwest ports, put straight on a train. So what you typically see is a spike in weekly customs import shipments into Seattle, and then the week after you'll see a volume of containers moving out across that particular Chicago lane. If I wanted to look at for example, the breakdown of that volume, I could look at weekly outbound rail, so it'll be O-rail. That's how our tickers are designed. So it's weekly outbound rail, and if I look at Seattle, I could type in Seattle, and I could type in Seattle, Chicago, which is what I've typed. So that's what we've built there. If I wanted to look at, again, if I just click that, that'll replace the same chart that I had, but I just wanted to show you how it's designed. You can do weekly for weekly outbound, or WI would be weekly inbound. If I wanted to look at weekly inbound rail into Seattle, I would type Y rail, WIRAIL, and I could tell that that's the volume of containers that have been moving into Seattle. So that's the weekly total that are moving in that particular area. And I could compare this to outbound. I could do that quickly and show you the relationship between inbound and outbound. It's important to look at those. If I wanted to look at outbound as the main, and I'll take off inbound, and I said, okay, what's the length of container that they're moving? I could type in WORail 53 loaded.sea, and I typed in Chicago. You can see here what I've done is I've typed in WO, weekly outbound, rail, 53-foot containers, L for loaded, and I've typed in Seattle, Chicago. And this is really interesting because now you start to break down the number of containers that are moving by container length. So let me do this for 53, 40s, and 20s. Seattle, Chicago, add that. And then I'm going to add, this is very interesting again, because I talked about it in the Daily Watch this morning, so it could be somewhat repetitive for those that read the Daily Watch, but I think it's worth going through this again to show you what's happening here. Loaded.SEACHI. So what you see here, again, if I flip, I'm going to flip 53s as the main, and then I'm going to take off the total. I'm going to take off that one. Right. So what you see here is, and again, I'll just make this a line chart rather than a mountain. Right. So what you see here is really interesting, that since this particular week here, if I look at my crosshair, if you look at from 831, you can see that 53s, which is the green line, not a lot of increase, 1669 to 1701. So, basically about 30 extra 53-foot containers moved on that lane. But look at the increase here from 1492 to 1912. There was a substantial increase in 40-foot containers, weekly outbound rail volume 40, and a big increase in 20s. And recall on the prior slide, we looked at the weekly customs imports into Seattle, and they increased the prior week. So what this tells me is the imports that came in on ships on the week prior to Labor Day, by the time they got unloaded and cleared customs and made their way to the rail line, what we saw was a far fewer of those got transloaded into 53s, which is capacity, which is volume that could have went on a truck, which gets to pricing on those lanes, and how competitive the two modes are. Generally speaking, it's about $900 cheaper to move a container from Seattle to Chicago than it is Los Angeles to Chicago. So that's why a lot of shippers are routing their international containers through Seattle because of the direct relationship. But what this chart tells you is that in the last week ending Sunday, the vast majority of those containers that arrived on the import ocean side found their way onto trains intact. So they moved across the country as a 20-foot container and a 40-foot container, but very little change in the volumes of 53s on the intermodal side. So this is how you can start to dig into different data sets. Now let me do something else here. I'm going to take out these ones here. So this is the intermodal volume. And if I wanted to look at intermodal volume and compare it to spot rates, intrm.seachi. And what I'm going to show you here is the relationship between spot rates and intermodal volumes. And I'm not looking for a correlation here because sometimes there aren't correlations because intermodal volumes have been declining on certain lanes and there's been a lot of competitive pressure from truckload. So part of the problem here for intermodal carriers has been the extra capacity in the truckload market that has kept intermodal rates down, generally speaking. If I blow this out a bit further, what you can see is that last year spot rates increased on the Seattle-Chicago lane. Remember, this was when the big pull forward of pre-tariff freight arrived. And you can see here when volumes spiked. Volume spiked in October, November, December. This was a lot of the pre-tariff pull forward of freight to avoid the January 1 proposed tariff. And as volumes and capacity as volumes have sort of remained relatively the same all the way across there hasn't been a lot of change other than some changes around Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July. Spot rates have been fairly low on those lanes. So right now, intermodal spot rates are about $1.06 a mile on the Seattle to Chicago lane. I'm not sure what the exact truckload rate is, but I could type in here DAT dot, and I could look at the VN. I think it's VN. I could look at the West Coast. I could look at the West Coast rate, and you can see that the West Coast rate is $1.52. So rail right now on the Chicago lane is $1.07 a mile. That's an all-in rate. The DAT rate doesn't include the fuel surcharge here. So right now on that particular rail line, you can see why shippers would be looking to move their freight via intermodal in both 53, 40, and 20-foot configurations because of the rate per mile that they can get access to out of the Seattle market. So why this is important for SONAR users, this tells you about how freight volumes are changing around the country. And I'll show you another map here that I think is quite telling. And this will be the top 10. I think if I look at the top 10 intermodal lanes here, you might be able to see what I'm getting at, which is there's a change in volume across the country. And it's got to do with the change in trade flows. So you can see some of these ports here, like if I go to New York to Chicago, for example, what you see is that if I go to year to date, you can see the trend upwards. And this is important because if I do the same thing out of I'll do WO rail, so it'll be weekly outbound rail, and I'm just going to type in LA. I'm going to put a period in there. LAXCHI. Too many L's. L dot LAXCHI, and compare the two, and I'll put them on a dual axis. So what's been happening is that in the last little while, we've seen a shift where volumes out of Los Angeles to Chicago are falling off, whereas volumes to the East Coast are on the increase. Now, there's a little bit of volatility here, but if I take off if I take off this and make it year to date, what you can see here is that if I go in and put a trend line on this, and I do this on a year to date basis, and I draw it from the first week, and I'll do it to the week just before Labor Day, which is that before the drop in volume, you can see that volumes increased over that period of time. So there's a generally speaking, there's an increase in container volume to the East Coast of the United States as opposed to the West Coast. And this is important because the outbound rail volumes from Savannah, Brunswick, Baltimore, Elizabeth, New Jersey, or the New York market tells you a lot about how freight's moving and why this is really important for asset-based carriers and brokers and shippers. There's much more freight being redirected to the East Coast from non-China manufacturing locations. This is important. As a result of the trade war, what we've seen is some shippers have readjusted their supply chain, and they're now getting a lot more freight from non-China countries in Southeast Asia. Why is this a big deal? Well, what it means is that it's now more efficient and closer and cheaper to route shipping freight or imports into the United States through the Suez Canal to the East Coast, as opposed to what normally happened when we were getting most of our imports from China. Those China imports would go to the West Coast of the United States first, and then those vessels would go down around up through the Panama Canal to the East Coast. So as companies have realigned their supply chains and found manufacturers in Southeast Asia, what we're seeing is an increase in volume to the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. And we're seeing that volumes in particular on some of these ports now, like Seattle in particular, Elizabeth, New Jersey's got 4 ports in that whole port of New Jersey and New York. Those volumes are increasing. Again, if I could go in here and look at WCSTM.EWR, which will be WCSTM.EWR, which will be New York. What we should be able to see here is the same trend. So as the orange line has increased, which is the volume of import shipments, and remember, you can have multiple shipments per container. As it has increased, in particular since April, so has the volume of shipments on the rail side. And of course, some of that volume flows over into the trucking side. If I take off that and type in OTVIM.EWR, which will be the outbound tender volume index out of Elizabeth, New Jersey, on the trucking side, I see a similar pattern where volumes have been increasing month over month. In fact, if I do something here and have a look at OTVIY, outbound tender volume change year over year for Elizabeth, New Jersey, what I will see is that outbound tender volumes are up 39%. So outbound tender volumes on the truckload side are up 39.9% year to date. And you can see the relationship there between weekly outbound rail volume on New York to Chicago, which is one of the main lanes that container volumes run. Some runs to Atlanta, some runs to Columbus, but it's a major volume lane. So why all this is important is this kind of completes the picture for asset-based carriers, brokers, and shippers. It tells you a lot about, on the import side, through our weekly customs, WCSTM, or just CSTM is the ticker. If you type in CSTM.EWR, you'll see the volume of imports coming into the port on the ocean side. Eventually, that freight is going to find its way to a truck or a train, or to a dray operator, or to a distribution center for a P&D truck to deliver locally. So it's important to watch all of these because they're all interconnected. And no matter how many tickers I show you here, we'll see a similar trend where there is more volume, in particular in ports like Savannah and Miami. You can see the volumes increasing. For asset-based carriers, brokers, and shippers, this is important because it changes how you look at freight markets in particular. You're going to see more volume coming in the retail season leading up to the Christmas holiday period. Typically, intermodal volumes increase high earlier in the season than truckload. The reason is that intermodal is looking at peak volumes around now, because a lot of that inventory that intermodal moves takes longer to move. So volumes on the intermodal side are peaking now, whereas volumes on the truckload side will peak a little bit later because the truckload side moves more time-sensitive goods in the supply chain. So right now we're seeing some of the peaking in rail volumes nationally, and truckload volumes will follow. What I've been able to show you today, and I know we're almost up on time, but I wanted to leave time if there needs to be any questions. Are we able to do questions, Mariah? Okay, so we might be able to have some questions. But what I've essentially shown you today while we load up the question tab here is I've shown you the way we can break the weekly railroad traffic data that's published, the 238,000. I can show you now, and you can go in and look at any particular lane. There are thousands of lanes: Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. The nomenclature is O or I for outbound, inbound, the word rail, and then you type in the length of the container and then load and empty, and then the particular market. So it's reasonably simple. It takes a little bit of practice. We can also look at volume of containers moving internationally. We can do that at a later stage. But essentially what you've now got is a way to look at daily, weekly, monthly, yearly volumes by 5 container lengths, by loaded status, and you can also look at it between Canada and Mexico. We'll have some tickers out shortly that will be able to show you how volumes are moving internationally. You can see how car parts and autos, things like that, are moving between countries. All really important data sets to be able to take the sort of the pulse of the domestic freight economy. So Mariah, what have we got on the question side? All right. Oh, okay, that's a great question. Let's go back to that one. How are there more petroleum cars? That was because I had it on a dual axis. Let me load that up again. And again, jump into the Zoom meeting tab, folks, and just type in any question you've got there. I'll load up a chart because it's a really good question, and my apologies for not explaining that a little bit more clearly. I'll go back and recreate the chart. I had RTO TC, which is total carloads, and the question was, why are crude oil cars more? Now, if I go in and type in RTO rail traffic originated by petroleumproducts.usa, and if I put it on it depends on what view you want on the y-axis. On an absolute basis, there's 239,000, and there's only 11,000 on the petroleum products side. But if I change this to a dual axis and put the crude on a y-axis over here, you'll see that it's 11,653 versus 238,000. Now, I think, was that the question, Mariah? I think that was what the question was. It depends on the axes that you choose. And if I wanted to look at the relative, which is the rate of change over the time frame that's shown, if I want to look at year to date, I can see that year to date carloads are down 14% and petroleum products are down about 0%, but with a lot more volatility. So the answer to the question, I think I had it on a different view, but essentially they're on the carloads are the background, the grey background. You can see they're at 238,000. And we've got the green line here, which is petroleum products at 11,653. Any other questions there? All right. So what I'd like to do is maybe just show you, talk a little bit about the top 10 lanes here. We've got about 8 minutes left, so we'll keep going through some of these. I think this is, we're going to see some fairly big changes in the container business, the intermodal business. There's generally some downward pressure on rates generally. What we heard about last week, some of the big railroads announced that they were going to start up some of their intermodal services that they'd cancelled. So I think there's a general concern in the industry that there's been too much volume shift back to road because we've had so much road capacity in the market. Maybe we could just look at some of those ways that we measure road capacity, and I could show you, for example, some really interesting correlations between, if I look at INTRM again, spot rates for intermodal.usa, and I plot that on a 1 year basis, and then I go in and look at where rail is the most competitive. So rail is on the intermodal side is really strong in the 800-mile plus. I think the railroads would like to get into some of the shorter lengths of haul and compete with trucking as more freight moves to the East Coast. I think they'd like to do a lot more short line work if they could and compete with trucking. That's generally the view that the people on the railroad have. But with so much loose capacity in the market, if I look at the way we measure capacity through our outbound tender rejections, and if I type in LOTRI dot, I could type in, I think I might have LAX Chicago, LAXCHI. No, I don't have it at that level. But I could type in LAX, or I could type in just USA and have a look at the long haul outbound tender rejection index, which is tender rejections in the 800-mile space. And what you see is a really tight correlation. So spot rates, which is intermodal spot rates for 53-foot dry vans, has a really tight correlation with the long-haul outbound tender reject index. Now, remember from your previous studies with SONAR that the direction of the outbound tender reject index is also the same direction that spot rates are moving. So as this line, as the tender rejection rate drops, there's downward pressure on spot rates. And you can see that on the intermodal side, rates have also dropped at the same rate. Now, if I go in here and I'll make LOTRI the highlight, and I take out, or I can add in DATVF.VNU, which will be the long haul outbound rate for dry vans, and I'll put that on a 1-year basis. What you can see here is that truckload rates, or the intermodal rates, have typically been higher than truckload nationally for a long period of time. But you can see how the relationship between dry van rates and the long haul outbound tender rejection index, which is the grey background, the two tracked each other almost identically all the way down here until we got to the produce season. So a lot of this bump you see in freight rates here is primarily the produce season, as more refrigerated trucks went into the produce sector during the typical summer season. And that meant that rates went up because there were fewer trucks to haul the dry van freight typically. That's how it works. But the two work, intermodal and truckload rates, kind of work directionally in the same way. If I take this onto a 1-month view, you see a little bit more volatility. But generally what we're seeing in the market right now is that you can see this jump from about 1.35% up to 4.79. So that's a sign that capacity is tightening somewhat in the long haul sector. Rates on the green line here, spot rates are moving up. So that's definitely a great sign for asset-based carriers. Maybe not so on the shipper's side, but capacity is still quite loose in the market. Intermodal spot rates have been relatively flat for a little while. We expect them to start increasing over time. So if you just think about where the market is right now, there, in terms of how the intermodal industry looks at trucking, it's constantly talking about excess capacity in the market. And that's worrisome for the railroads, particularly in the long haul sector where team transport becomes a viable competitor to even the fastest trains, because 2 drivers can get pretty much anywhere in this country in a couple of days without too much effort. And of course, why that is worrisome for the intermodal side of the industry is it's got a lot to do with the fact that on either end of a train move, you've got a dray move with a truck typically. And that adds more time and congestion and cost. So that's where the two have been. We're not sure exactly when the market will turn, but we think capacity is going to tighten on the truckload side very shortly. There is some signs that if I take off inbound rates and I compare this to OTVI.USA in terms of just freight volume generally, there is an upward trend in freight volumes. I'll just wrap up on this because it's an important place to be in terms of where volumes are going. Certainly on the truckload side, this gives some cause for concern on the intermodal side. But if I look at this, if I do seasonality and I'll take that to 1 year, what you see is that this year, and I'll just change this to a shorter period of time here. I'll just let this load. Right. So the grey background here, and I'll just put this on a 3-month view. The grey background is this year's outbound tender volume. The green line is last year's. So outbound tender volumes are up on the truckload side about 3% year over year. We're waiting to see how those numbers come out tomorrow. But we expect that the truckload volumes will continue to increase between now and year end. But again, it's important to watch the intermodal volumes because on the longer lengths of haul, intermodal is going to be a strong competitor with truckload. And that's why it's been important to add the intermodal volumes in. If you're a truckload carrier, I'd be focusing on the 20-foot, 40-foot, and 53-foot markets because that's where you're going to find most of the competitive pressure from shippers in particular who are seeing a downward trend in spot rates on the rail side. So, the shippers that are providing a lot of our freight are watching intermodal spot rates. They're looking at their contract rates and figuring out how they can move freight quicker. And of course, with so much truckload capacity in the market, truckload's been able to eat into some of that market share. So I'm going to pause there, wrap up the conversation today. That's a really quick overview of our market that we've got in relation to both carloads and intermodal volumes and how we look at the market and compare different indices, in particular comparing intermodal volumes to the ocean imports through our weekly and monthly customs data sets. Again, shoot us a question, drop us an email. Happy to send you some of the links to the screenshots that I built. And again, happy to answer any questions you've got after the webinar. Thank you.